Welcome to On the Other Hand, and a special welcome to these new subscribers and any other new viewers. After talking to my brother about the last Rotten Tomatoes video, he went and found someone who has scraped all the data from the Rotten Tomatoes site. So now we can dig in and do some real comparing. I'll run through some results from the new data, compare them to the top 100 results from the last video, and then I'll do a real top movies list of all-time countdown. As always, links are in the description below. So the big question is, how do the graphs and trends from the top 100 lists hold up to the trends for the entire dataset? For the average critic rating over the course of 20 years, you can see that there has been a steady increase. The number of critic reviews has also risen steadily. The average audience rating has hung around 60%, which is pretty consistent all things considered. And if you watched the previous video, you might remember that the number of audience reviews in the top 100 lists was on a steep decline, and that holds for the whole dataset as well. It looks like Rotten Tomatoes was growing in popularity from 2000 up to 2005, but there was a steep drop-off in audience reviews, which is fascinating because the number of critic reviews is still on the rise. And if we look at the year as a whole and do a difference between the critic and audience rating, here's what we get for the past 20 years. I think this makes the findings from the previous video even more interesting, so let's do some comparing. So here on the left, we have the data from the top 100 list data set from the previous video, and on the right, we have the same metric without the Rotten Tomatoes pre-screening what makes it into the data set. For these first couple, like critic rating and number of critic reviews, they actually follow quite closely, which is cool to see. When it comes to audience rating, there is some more variance, which is interesting but expected, as the top 100 lists were chosen based on critic, not audience reviews. The curve for the number of audience reviews is practically identical between the two datasets, which is cool to see. But the most telling comparison is the critic minus audience rating, because this shows a clear difference between the two datasets. It's not too much of a surprise, as a list based on high critic ratings is going to have a selection bias towards critics liking movies, but it's cool to see that there isn't too significant of a trend with critic and audience differences overall. I wanted to flesh out critic and audience differences some more, so I'll zoom through 20 histograms of each year, showing the distribution of differences by year. It's always fun to see these pretty bell curves appear out of data, and they are centered on and around 0 overall. Yes, there is some variation year to year, but I just love to see data come out like this. These graphs are interesting enough that I want to include them, but there's not a ton to talk about on a given year. Finally, I want to put out a data-driven top movies of all time list, according to Rotten Tomatoes' own data. Last video, I mentioned I didn't think Black Panther deserved its spot as best movie of all time. From their list, you might notice that there is a modern bias. Most of the movies are from the last couple of years, but this is to be expected, as Rotten Tomatoes has only been a significant website for the past 2 decades. So I don't mind my top list having the same sort of bias as the data it came from. To come up with a more legitimate best movies of all time list, I just did a simple filter for each of the major metrics. I took the whole data set Rotten Tomatoes has, and I cut out anything that didn't have a 90% or better on both critic and audience ratings. And I cut out any movie with less than 250 critic reviews and less than 1 million audience reviews. That simple process eliminated all but 7 movies, and for this final list, I sorted them based on how much money they made. So at number 7 in the best movies of all time, based on a best-selling book and grossing $378 million, we have Slumdog Millionaire. Number 6 shows that middle movies, like Middle Children, are simply the best, and grossing $444 million, we have Bourne Ultimatum. With an opener like number 5, is it any surprise that this cinematic universe has taken over the film industry and Halloween costumes for many years? Grossing $585 million, we have Iron Man. Number 4 has the highest critic rating in this list and has the best 15-minute opener you will ever see. The movie grossed an amazing $735 million. This is Disney Pixar's Up. At number 3, we have a representation from one of the greatest trilogies of all time, and is another shout out to Middle Children and middle movies everywhere. Grossing $943 million, we have Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers. At number 2, we have the movie that everyone rants and raves about, and it's great to see their faces when I tell them I haven't actually seen this apparent masterpiece. It grossed $1 billion, we have at number 2, The Dark Knight. And finally at number 1, we have the groundbreaking movie that grossed over $1.5 billion and brought together several movie series into a satisfying and iconic crossover. It is none other than Marvel's The Avengers. I hope this countdown was both more recognizable than the previous video, as well as gave greater closure to the questions about movie trends over the past 2 decades. As always, thanks, hope you enjoyed, And if you did, consider subscribing and hitting the bell so you'll get notified for new uploads.